Chapter 3 of A Bowl of Heaven, written by Evangeline Adams, narrated by Lori Carvelli of Keys Astrology. Chapter 3 A Tale of Two Cities. It has been my experience that the bigger and finer the man, the quicker, the more complete his acceptance of astrology teachings. 30 years ago, last month, a man walked into my studio, which was then in the Copley Hotel in Boston, and asked for a reading. There was nothing unusual in that experience. Men and women have been doing just that for more years than I like to remember or record. But the man himself was unusual in both appearance and manner. "Miss Adams," he said, "I'm John Burroughs." This remark, natural and obvious as it now seems, was at the time astounding, for people came to me in those days with hat brims down and coat collars up, and lied scandalously as to their real names and stations in life. They were ashamed to be seen even by themselves in the company of an astrologer. That meeting in Boston was the beginning of a close friendship, which resulted in many happy, helpful hours of study and investigation, sometimes here in my studio, sometimes at Mr. Burroughs' beloved Slabsides, during which my fine old friend and I, he from the naturalist's viewpoint, and I from the astrologer's, sought the truth about life. I remember, as if it were yesterday, the details of that first talk in Boston. Mr. Burroughs had come to ask me about a crisis in his domestic affairs. It was clear that he was worried and distraught, but while he was sitting in my waiting room, something happened which so diverted his attention that he almost forgot the errand on which he came. "Look," he exclaimed, waving at my morning paper in the air. "Look, look what they have done to me!" And he pointed to what purported to be a long interview with him, written out of the air by a man who had never even seen him. It was one of these question and answer affairs in which, among other things, the great naturalist was asked what he would do if he had $3,000, and was made to say in reply that he didn't know. I remember asking him a question, the answer to which I shall never forget. "Why do you, a naturalist, believe in astrology?" "Why do I believe in astrology?" he repeated. "Why shouldn't I? Everything in the universe influences everything else, so naturally the stars must influence man." Not all of the big men and women who come to see me have Mr. Burroughs' faith in astrology, but most of them come back to me later with a belief based on their own experience. Here is such a case, a sort of reluctant admission which I value because it came to me from my old pastor in Boston at the time when I was experiencing considerable opposition from my relatives. "Dear Miss Adams, I confess that I do not see why or how the planets can be the rulers of human life, or why Mercury should determine one quality in man and Saturn in another, but you predicted things which have come true, and told me most remarkable things about myself. How you found them out I do not know, but I feel sure of your good faith and wish you success. Sincerely yours, Minot J. Savage." That letter and similar words of encouragement from other friends encouraged me to keep up the fight during those early Boston years, just as the famous men and women who afterward believed in me have been among my chief inspirations in the crowded years since my arrival in New York. The life stories that have been told me would make a very representative library of American biography, and the letters they've written me, letters of gratitude and appreciation, are overwhelming evidence that they are not sorry they hitched their wagons to the stars. One of my closest friends in Boston was Louise Chandler Moulton, the poetess. Her husband was a fine, devoted, but extremely conservative man with whom at times she became very dissatisfied. We often discussed horoscopes in a friendly way, and I remember telling her once that the year 1897 was to be a very fortunate year for her. "How can that be?" she resorted. "You haven't told me I am to be a widow that year, and my freedom is the only thing in the world that will still make me happy." Some years later she came into my studio in a deeper mourning and apparently broken-hearted. Her attitude amazed and annoyed me, and I accused her of downright hypocrisy. This attack brought from her a pathetic confession. She'd been sincere in what she'd said years before about her freedom, but now that she had it, she realized it wasn't worth It was worth nothing compared to the unselfish love of a husband she'd lost. I have thousands of such cases, and I always try to bring to the consciousness of such clients before it's too late that if they would only work as hard to make a success of their marriage as they would have in any other job, there would be fewer matrimonial failures. Several years ago in New York, I had a similar case. The wife of a famous New York merchant came to me to ask if she should divorce her husband with whom she was unhappy and marry a man whose date she also gave me. I took out 3 of my clock-like horoscope sheets, on which I make my calculations about the position of the stars, and started to read the 3 horoscopes with special regard to their relation to each other. The first I saw was that my client and her lover would never be happy together, that they might not even marry if they had the chance, and the second thing which the stars indicated as clearly as the dawn indicates the coming day was that her husband would not live anyway beyond the following July. Here, obviously, were 2 good reasons why the law should not be invoked to usurp nature's perfect work. So I advised her strongly not to seek divorce. To her, I gave as my reason what the stars showed me about the second man. Like most infatuated people, she would not admit anything against her lover, but she left me considerably sobered. Weeks passed without divorce on her part, but without death on his, and I recalled the threatening indications. At the 1st of July approached, I could not get the prediction out of my mind. The man was not dead, but 2 days later I opened the morning paper and read of the sudden death of the well-known merchant on a fishing trip in a distant state. Destiny fulfills itself. Incidentally, my client, still a widow. As the stars indicated, she did not marry the man for whom she was eager to divorce her husband. Many of my earlier visitors, and later ones too, were concerned with the matter of marriage and remarriage, and I'll never forget the day a great giant of a man, 6'3" or 4" at least, walked into my studio, half leading, half carrying a girl dwarf about 22 inches high. The man was Frank C. Bostock. The girl was Chiquita, the midget in his show. They showed me that they were in love with each other and wanted to know if they should marry. But the most shocking experience of my early years was the first time all 3 parties to a divorce suit came to me at different times and unbeknown to me to get my prediction as to its result. Since that time, such experiences become so common that they do not excite me at all. I've been consulted in almost every important divorce case since I came to New York, sometimes before, sometimes during, sometimes after the trial, sometimes by the wife, sometimes by the husband, sometimes by the correspondent. Of course, many of my Boston friends had much more altruistic interest in astrology. Hezekiah Buttersworth, whose long association with a loose youth's companion made him sort of a demigod to the youngsters of my generation, he was especially enthusiastic about the part the stars should play in the development of young people. I told Mr. Butterworth that his own modesty and supersensitiveness, which were hampering influences in his life, might have been controlled if he had been taught by astrology at an early age to consider himself a valuable instrument through which powers might operate, rather than an individual hampered by self-consciousness. The great man not only accepted this analysis of his character — I don't know how I had the courage to talk to him so frankly unless I got it from the stars — but he said that it gave him, even at his advanced age, a better understanding that he'd never had before of his latent powers and possibilities. Joseph Jefferson was also a frequent caller during the Boston days. The beloved Rip was a firm believer in science and instilled his faith in other members of his family. Many years later, his daughter-in-law, Christine MacDonald, became a client of mine, and at her request, I frequently consulted Mr. Jefferson's chart during his last days. It was my sad duty to foresee the great man's death and to know in advance that it would happen within 30 days of the time it actually took place. Joe Jefferson was a delightful talker, especially on his own subject, and I never tired of listening to his stories of the stage. He held the theory that acting was strictly an intellectual exercise, and that emotions of the actors in no way helped him put over to the audience the emotions of the character he might be depicting. He gave an example in his own experience the night he received the news of his mother's death. It was too late to disappoint the audience gathered in front of the curtain, so he decided to go through his trying role. He said that in a more pathetic part he actually felt for the first time the emotions he was portraying, but on that night these particular scenes failed absolutely to get over to the audience. There were many interesting theatrical folk in Boston during this period. The Boston Museum Stock Company was at the height of its popularity, numbering among its favorites William Warren, Mrs. Gilbert, Annie Clark, Emma Sheridan, Jack Mason, and Miriam O'Leary. Annie Clark was one of my most devoted clients. Later, I occupied for one season her summer home in Wellesley. John Mason frequently consulted my friend and fellow astrologer Oliver Ames Gould, who warned him in vain against his disastrous marriage with the beautiful Marian Manola. The horoscopes of both of these talented artists indicated they would neutralize each other, and that they did. Mason, as everybody knows, went down in the depths, and it was not until after his divorce that he again assumed the position on stage to which his great talents entitled him. Fanny Davenport is another famous stage personality who consulted me in my early astrological career. She was in deep trouble at the time in which I was of some comfort. She impressed me as a woman of infinite sweetness. So did Lillian Russell. The two women were curiously alike in the sympathetic kindliness of their spirit. In all my experience with celebrities of the stage, I have never known a more thoughtful, friendly, gracious person than the great Lillian. It amuses me to remember that Miss Russell presented me with a formula of a beauty cream which she used, a preparation which she has later been commercialized and sold by the ton under her famous name. During my stay in Copley Square, one of my famous neighbors was Phillips Brooks, who had been a not very distant neighbor of mine in Andover. Bishop Brooks had a summer home in North Andover, from which he used to drive to the Andover station to catch what was called by courtesy the good train to Boston. I can see him now stalking into the crowded train, his great body filling the doorway, his arms invariably filled with heavy books and an inevitable umbrella. I conceived an early dislike for this delightful man because he seemed to have no hesitancy, even on the most crowded trips, in occupying an entire seat. I was shocked, too, as most of his Andover neighbors were, to learn that he had special cigars made for him, and that he took great boxes with him whenever he was going abroad or on any kind of long journey. Later I learned that he wrote his best sermons sitting in an easy chair with one of those special cigars in his mouth. But when I had an opportunity, as I later did many times, to listen to his finest efforts in Trinity Church across the square from my studio, I no longer begrudged him his tobacco or his extra seat. I made it a rule early in my career not to break appointments, and I cannot help feeling that this rule has contributed largely to my success. Only once I've made an exception, and that was afterward in New York during my visit of the Prince of Wales. One of my clients, whose friendship I value highly, is the director of the Horse Show Association, and on the occasion of the prince's visit to the show, he sent me an invitation to sit in a box and see the honored guest at close range. The temptation was too much. I left the studio just in time to arrive at the hour when the prince was expected, and left the moment he took departure. Altogether, I was away from Carnegie Hall 1 hour and a half, 3 appointment periods. Upon my return, my secretary met me with an unprecedented news that all 3 of the people scheduled for the appointments had canceled their time or failed to appear. Perhaps this incident tends to prove that there are no such things as accidents. Perhaps I might have succeeded just as well as if I had cut more appointments and gone to more parties. One of my frequent callers was B. O. Flower, editor of the Arena. Mr. Flower became sufficiently interested in the astrological science to publish a series of articles by Dr. Smith. O. M. Hansom, head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, often consulted me in regard to his important cases. Dr. A. M. Fair, head surgeon in one of the big Boston hospitals, told me that he thought thought it more than likely that astrology, by picking the right days for operations, could be of material assistance to modern surgery. That is now a fact. Gypsy Smith, the evangelist, Arthur Farwell, the musician, Camille Darvell, the actress, Lillian Whiting, the writer, Oliver Ames Gould himself, a brilliant astrologer, and Frank Sanborn, Ralph Waldo Emerson's secretary and friend, who told me at the great Concord philosopher, had been much interested in the science. These important people of Boston of the day, along with John Burroughs and Dr. Savage and Dr. Smith, were my earthly guiding mundane stars during my first hard years. My reputation as an astrologer brought me a good many interesting social acquaintanceship, from which I have gathered much useful experience and some lasting inspiration. I vividly recall running elbows with H. G. Wells, who was, I think, on his first visit to America. Some friends of mine on Beacon Street entertained him at dinner at the suggestion of Nathaniel Haskell Dole, who was at the time sort of a literary master of ceremonies for the Boston Society. Perhaps it would be fair to say that Mr. Dole did the entertaining of Mr. Wells at the expense of his wealthy Beacon Street acquaintances. Anyway, there was a dinner, and I was there, at the right hand of the already famous British novelist, and I was thrilled. There was the usual company of Bostonians. I remember especially Mrs. Arthur Carmichael, wife of the famous chemist, who was first to say that every atom has consciousness, but not self-consciousness. Charlotte Porter, the popular poetess, and Rabbi Charles Fleischer, the Beau Brummel of Back Bay. This party made a tremendous impression on my unsophisticated mind, for I had not yet discovered that celebrities are just folks, and in appearance often less so. Mr. Wells was no exception, small of stature, inclined to sarcasm, not very complimentary about America or about anything else except himself and George Bernard Shaw. But at least he was agreeable to me and did not answer my disappointed gaze with a cutting remark that is credited to another visiting Englishman. "Madam, I do not write books with my clothes." He was suffering at the moment from acute Shawitis. GBS, George Bernard Shaw, was his close friend and guiding influence. He could talk little of else. He was most impatient with the American attitude toward the iconoclast. He said we took Shaw far too seriously, and that as a result he was having a lot of fun with it. I tried to get him off Shaw and onto astrology, off his subject and onto mine, but my limited worldly experience was not equal to the task. I haven't seen Mr. Wells for many years, and I suspect that if he were my dinner companion tonight, the suggested topic was George Bernard Shaw, the task of diverting the conversation to other channels might not be so difficult. When I came to New York, association with the great and not so great became quite the ordinary routine of my life. I enjoyed much more personal freedom because I was relieved from my family persecution, at least from the depressing effect of daily contact with it. And the immediate result of the Windsor fire was to bring me an interesting and an influential class of people, the class whose continuing support has been the bulwark of my success. At the old Continental Hotel at 21st Street and Broadway, where I took refuge after the fire, I was immediately besieged by reporters and clients. My callers on the first day numbered some of the best-known names in New York's social and business life, and the long list of those who followed them, nearly 100,000 in 26 years, would make me a very respectable edition of Who's Who. The first celebrity to seek me out was Lillian Nordica. I don't remember now what she asked me, but I do remember the very unfortunate impression she made on me. Madame Nordica was a woman of great charm and distinction, but it wasn't until I made out her chart and discovered that she must be truly of great personage that I accepted her at full value. Being from Boston, and as you've seen, from the most conservative circle of that conservative city, I naturally felt that anyone who could use lip salve, paint, and powder was doomed. Another first visitor was Miss Leslie Carter, and I remember her well not only because she was so impressed by the things I told her that she prolonged the interview far beyond the allotted time, but because she insisted on paying me a double fee. I found many famous people very ready to listen to astrological advice, but sometimes, like the man in the street, unwilling to take it. Many years later, when Mary Garden was considering the management of the Chicago Opera House, I told her the stars would be absolutely unfavorable for any new kind of work. Mary didn't heed my advice. But many months later, she sent me an appreciation of the soundness of my prediction, a beautiful photograph, appropriately autographed. One young woman who did take my advice came to see me in the early years in New York. She was at the time the most promising dramatic actress on the American stage and had been under consideration a proposal of marriage from a prominent theatrical manager. Her mother, who accompanied her, was herself a well-known actress and thought she should jump at the chance. Daughter was less sure. I didn't know the names of either the women or the manager, but as soon as I took one look at the horoscope of the younger woman, I saw clearly she was destined to marry a much more wealthy suitor. The daughter accepted this announcement calmly enough, but the mother, thinking I had ruined her daughter's chances, became very angry and told me all the names in the case and asked how I dared influence her daughter against her advice. The old lady was so vehement that I rather wondered myself how I dared stand up against her, but I did. And I lived to see the young woman the happy wife of one of the wealthiest bankers of his day. Mothers of famous actresses and singers are often difficult to handle, and Geraldine Ferrars was no exception. But one thing she told me that I shall never forget because it showed the part which astrology played in her daughter's wonderful career. When Miss Farrar was still a very young girl, a rich person in Boston, both told Mrs. Farrar that if she would take her daughter's horoscope to my friend Oliver Adams Gould, who was known to be an excellent astrologer, and obtain a statement from Mr. Gould that the young woman's chart indicated a musical career, money would be forthcoming. The world knows the rest. But maybe it doesn't know what I know because I too have read Geraldine Farrar's horoscope, and her stars, indicated as clearly as the sunset indicates the night, success by the throat. In those days, women still came to me swathed in veils, and men with collars turned up and hats pulled down. Even as late as 1914, astrology had no legal standing in the great state of New York. It ranked with fortune telling, palm reading, and much other abused experiments with the occult, and his exponents were open to arrest and prosecution. In that year, however, in a suit which settled the question of all time, I secured a decision which recognized and legalized this oldest of the sciences, and raised my profession as a legal part with law and medicine. There's an archaic law in the state of New York which purports to protect the community against acrobatic performers, circus riders, men who desert wives, and people who pretend to tell fortunes. All such people, according to the statute, are disorderly persons, of course. No use is now made of this half-forgotten law, so far as acrobatic performers and circus riders are concerned. In the spring, Madison Square Garden swarms with these disorderly persons, and even men who desert their wives are allowed to roam freely on the city streets. But the statute is still invoked for the benefit of some crank who wishes to ensnare what he considers a fortune teller. I do not say that aren't many frauds among the so-called fortune tellers, and that there shouldn't be laws to protect the public against them, but I'm inclined to believe that the protection is needed on both sides. In short, I sympathize with a characteristic editorial in the American Mercury, which said, in commenting on a recent crusade against this class, the crusaders were making a great show of hitting such members of the community as they have no power to hit back. They, the soothsayers, take money on theory that they are able to foretell events on the presumption that they are privy to the secrets of the future, and on the assurance that they can indicate cures, alleviate ills, and suggest the means of future well-being. Well, so do the chiropractors, osteopaths, so do gentlemen of the clergy, so do the stock and bond dealers of Wall Street, so do the Florida realtors, so do advertisers who guarantee they can grow hair on bald heads, teach piano by mail in 30 days, and make a brilliant conversationalist and great social favorite out of a mill hand. These persons, however, unlike fortune tellers, have, most of them, organizations of their own kind to protect them or their influence enough in one direction or another to keep the civic ULANs from making raids upon them. And so, in short, I'm for equal rights under the law, even for fortune tellers. All of which has nothing to do with, or should have nothing to do with, astrology, for even the most ignorant people now know that astrologers are not fortune tellers, nor shouldn't be if they are true to the teachings of their science, but the knowledge that has not prevented astrology's enemies from using this ancient law against fortune telling to embarrass and intimidate those who preach the gospel of the stars. The first case brought against me was thrown out in court. The judge stared from the bench after hearing the opposing witness that it was obvious that I had not broken the law, and that I had done nothing which could be construed as fortune telling, but I wasn't satisfied. I've always tried to visualize, just one step at a time, what I am pleased to call my career. First, I aimed to give my invalid mother the care and comfort she'd so beautifully earned. Second, I sought to establish myself as the best known astrologer in America, and now I had but one ambition, to legalize astrology in the state of New York. So when another enemy of the science came to anonymously secure a reading which she claimed was fortune telling and hailed me again to court, I went with a willing and determined heart. This time I retained the best counsel available, Clerk L. Gordon of New York, and told him that I wanted him to earn his money, not by having the case against me thrown out of court, by having it tried. I wanted to settle the question, and I did. The defendant, wrote Judge Freschi, in handling down his decision, raised astrology to the dignity of an exact science. Quote, she has given ample proof that she is a woman of learning and culture, one who's very well versed in astronomy and other sciences. Her chart here, as made out, may be verified, as she stated, in the books and records of the astronomy for years. In the reading of the horoscope, the defendant went through the absolute mechanical mathematical process to get at her conclusions. She claims that astrology never makes a mistake, though astrologers do, and that if the figures are correct, the information given is correct. The sincerity of the defendant's determination from her own perceptions and study of authorities cannot be questioned. She certainly does seem to have a thorough knowledge of the subject, and in this case she claims no faculty or foretelling by supernatural or magical means that which in the future, or of discovering that which is hidden and obscure, but she does claim that nature is to be interpreted by the influences that surround it. When the defendant prepared her horoscope of the complainant and calculated the relative positions of the planets at the time of birth, raising this horoscope on the well-known and fixed science of astronomy, she violated no law. I had gone into that courtroom with a pile of reference books and reached nearly to the ceiling, a mass of evidence that reached as far back as Babylonian seers, and I had insisted that in order to bring a demonstration of science down to the moment that I be allowed to cast a horoscope and give a reading then and there in the presence of the court. Judge Fresky said this request was reasonable. He did more than that. He gave me the dates of a person quite unknown to me, and from this day and hour and place of his unknown birth I told the judge things which he afterward admitted gave him a new insight into the person's mentality and character, a demonstration that was all the more impressive to him because the quote-unquote unknown turned out to be the judge's own son. Chapter 4. Dabbling in Heathenism. Sometimes as I look back, I smile to think how much easier it was to overcome the persecution of the law than the persecution of my own family. Naturally, I regarded the legalization of astrology as the finest thing an Adams had done since signing of the Declaration of Independence. But the Adamses didn't think so. In fact, from the very beginning, they opposed my connection with astrology by every means with their power. My father, though no fault of his own, had lost most of his money just before his death. The rest of it went into early education of my brother and myself. And at 18, when the boys had gone out into the world and boy-like assumed new responsibilities of their own, I found myself facing the double problem of supporting myself and providing most of my mother's livelihood. This was no sacrifice to me, for my mother had given herself to the last limit of her strength for her children, and she'd been one of the intimate family to sympathize with my interest in astrology. We had relatives in powerful positions who might have made my task a simple one, but I had already alienated a good many of them by what they called my strange beliefs. It horrified the descendants of John Adams to have one of their number dabbling in heathenism, quote unquote. From their point of view, they were justified. At Andover, I had come much under the influence of Elizabeth Stuart Phelps, whose book Gates Ajar was considered very advanced for those days, and whose house was a center of discussion and investigation of all sorts of isms. About this time, Professor Phelps started his theological colleagues by conducting some of the first American experiments in spiritualism, and my favorite among the teachers, dear kindly Professor Smythe, took a theological world by expressing the belief that man was not necessarily damned if he refused to accept the Andover brand of religion. His public trial for heresy stirred my imagination and turned my brain footsteps from the path of conventional religious thought. Elizabeth Phelps was a continuing influence in the same direction, even though she was my Sunday school teacher, and the most vivid memories of my Andover days are the long inspiring walks under the elms of the Log campus out on Salem Street in the company of the straight-thinking, brave-speaking New England heroine. In Boston, I continued my unorthodox studies, and I was not satisfied with conventional faith as it had been taught to me in Andover. I could not impute to God the petty narrowness which had actuated the persecution of my beloved Dr. Smythe, so I began delving into the religions of the Orient, seeking truth through philosophies other than our own. This sort of thing was bad enough for the Adamses, but when I began studying astrology under Dr. Smith, their anger was stirred as it hadn't been since King George III put tax on tea. I must admit that some of my methods of pursuing my studies were rather unorthodox, and not what Bostonians of those days had the right to expect of a nice young girl. Through Dr. Smith, I met another very distinguished physician and scholar, Dr. George Adams, who was at the time head of the state hospital for the insane at Westboro. The institution over which he presided ranked very high among the establishments of its kind, and Dr. Adams himself was considered a great expert in insanity. What he really was, though no one knew him but a few intimates, was an expert astrologer. Everything in that institution, from the care of the most violent patient to the purchase of the best kind of hens to lay breakfast eggs, was done according to the stars. Dr. Adams' first act when a new inmate was committed to his care was always to obtain the patient's birth data. His second move was to draw up his chart from the moment his entire treatment in that patient was directed as to guard against the danger points and develop the good points indicated in the chart. The rest was that Dr. Adams was quite the most interesting collection of unusual horoscopes then in existence, and naturally, to my family's great disgust, I spent many happy hours in the insane asylum. Dr. Smith had told me that I never fear an insane person, that my horoscopes indicated people off their balance, and they would always turn to me as their friend, as someone who could help them out of their predicament. That is why in later years I've been able to gain the confidence of so many people who are for at the moment dislodged from their spiritual balance, and to give them advice which they could not take from anyone else. You see, I was born under the influence of the human sign Aquarius, with more than an unusual number of planets rising in my chart. Sun and Mars, which give me courage, Mercury, which gives me mental understanding, and Neptune, which gives me spiritual understanding, Venus, which makes me possible, Venus, which makes possible the telling of ugly truths in a palatable form, and Jupiter, which should provide the priceless gift of tolerance. Those planets have carried me safely and successfully through 100,000 private conferences with all kinds of people, and they carried me just as safely and just as successfully through the violent ward at Westboro. Accompanied by Dr. Adams, the two guards who stood at the distance, I studied at first hand some of the most difficult and dangerous cases, and I was usually received as Dr. Smith had prophesied, as friend and savior. What impressed me most about the poor demented person was that most of them were absolutely sane except one or two points. One fellow had a way of asking people to feel an ailing tooth, then he would bite their fingers off. A woman always complained about the food and said Dr. Adams was feeding them on the corpses of patients who died boiled up in the soup. Otherwise, these people were as sane as I am, certainly more sane than a good many of my friends. I know one woman who goes absolutely off her head at the first clap of thunder. She rushes to the window, yanks down the curtains, lights up the lights, telephones her husband, and shuts herself in a closet till he comes home and fishes her out. Her fear is sane enough. Lightning does strike. But in her reactions, she's insane. She closes a window at the chief point of danger. She monkeys with the electrical conductor in the house. She puts herself in the worst possible position known to fire or to escape from it. Moreover, she interferes with the comforts of masculine peace of mind. She's a menace. A certain well-known novelist who makes his character do a manner of daring things as he himself proved courage never leaves the ground if he can help it in anything so giddy as an elevator. The only place he feels really safe is in a subway. But he is absolutely and sanely consistent. He never accepts an invitation till he knows whether the people live in a house or an apartment. He hasn't been able to see his best friend in years because a friend lives on the 12th floor. He wouldn't go to sleep on a mezzanine without trying out the fire escape. I first heard of this idiosyncrasy from a magazine editor who lives on the ground floor and is therefore very popular with a novelist. The editor thought it was a huge joke, which only goes to show how funny we are. That editor would no more enter an important conference, interview an important author, or buy an important present for his wife without getting his hair cut than he would go to bed without saying his prayers. It isn't that his brain works better with less on it. He's just crazy about haircuts, that's all. I have a close friend who feels the same way about moons. Last month he stepped out of an automobile in front of the Hotel Arlington in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The bellboy plunged down the steps for his luggage, and the doorman stuck out his hand for a tip. The chauffeur of the car behind stepped on his klaxon. A lad passing by remarked to his girlfriend that there was a new moon. My friend dropped his bag. He scorned the doorman's itching palm. He held up the local traffic while he revolved slowly, like a tower on a rotor ship, to see the new moon over his right shoulder and not through glass. Some people call this sort of thing superstition. I don't. I call it foolishness. And I think that if all people who are foolish on some point were thrown into the lockup, there would be nobody left to turn the key. I asked Dr. Adams why these people with only one idiosyncrasy were in his institution, and others equally unbalanced were allowed to roam the sidewalks. Some people do, he replied cynically, are not poor enough to be a burden or rich enough to be gotten out of the way. I'm going to repeat that. Some people, he replied cynically, are not poor enough to be a burden or rich enough to be gotten out of the way. Many years later, the venerable head of the State Institution of the Insane in New York made a remark to me that confirmed this conclusion, and then he added, 80% of the people in our insane asylums could be snapped back if someone like you would only talk to them. Thank you, I replied, but I've had enough trouble snapping back those that are out. I don't blame my relatives for objecting to my haunting or insane asylum, or for coming to the conclusion that I belong there, but I do blame them for the methods that adopted for snapping me to conventionality. I was earning my living at the time in the office of the Lord and Webster wholesale flour and grain merchants. Mr. Webster was my uncle by marriage, and Mr. Lord, as it turned out, cherished an ambition to achieve an even closer relationship by offering me his hand in marriage. Under such circumstances, my modest job as a private secretary seemed safe enough, but nothing in the world is safe without prejudice. Safe against prejudice. When my relatives heard that I was interested in the heathenish study of astrology, they attacked me on all sides. My aunt, the wife of my employer, wrote a bitter letter to my oldest brother in Chicago telling him that I was going to the dogs and that something was going to have to be done about it. Brother fortunately threw the letter in the wastebasket and didn't tell me of it until many years afterward, but the Home Guard kept up the fight. They protested against the nurse I'd engaged to take care of my mother on the grounds that she was a Catholic. As a matter of fact, the young woman, a Miss McKim, was sister of Bishop McKim, a famous Episcopal clergyman, and previous to her stay with us, had been living for 3 years in her brother's house in Japan. Poor girl. While I was at the office, my crusading kin made their life and my mother so miserable that I finally went to a lawyer friend of the family to see what I could do about it. He told me, inasmuch as I was paying the rent of all the other expenses, my relatives had no right to cross the threshold against my wishes, and he advised me that I should inform them. I did. But in view of the fact that my employer's wife was a ringleader of the family circus, I had no alternative but to resign my job, an action which precipitated my entrance into the field of professional astrology, the very step that my relatives had been seeking to avoid. It amazes me now to remember the only human being who had an encouraging word for me at the time outside of my mother was Dr. Smith, a man who printed my first professional cards. I am sorry that my early experience with Ego's cult caused my family so much pain, but for the sake of later work, I was not willingly part with my experience thus I will not willingly part with this experience thus gained. Naturally, I believe that no one of what I call the minor methods of listening in on the infinite is to be compared with astrology, and I've excluded them all from my own practice. What I tell my people is based solely on what I read in their charts. I reach my conclusions just as accurately for the person whom I've never seen as for the person who gazes at me from across my desk. I do not claim to be psychic or clairvoyant. I do not read minds or faces or handwriting or palms, but I do not scorn any of these attempts as long as they are honestly made to break through any veil which separates us from God's truth. The veil is a thin one. No one can say with certainty how it can be pierced. In this spirit, I spent one winter in Boston as a pupil of the great Shireo, who was then at the height of his popularity as a reader of the hand. Poor Shireo, his life, as I soon found by consultation of the horoscope, was destined to be a stormy one. His palm, too, indicated the same thing, but he was, and I dare say, still is, one of the most daring, dashing, handsome fellows for whom the journey through life is just one high adventure after another. Women were crazy about him, and in many ways he was a spoiled child. But he could read palms, and I learned a good deal about the art. Incidentally, I made a most interesting collection of palm autographs, which I retain in a book form, and cherish as one of the most valuable possessions. Whenever an especially well-known person or especially interesting one, and my experience has taught me that these two do not always coincide, come to see me, I would talk to them about palmistry and ask them for a flat hand autograph. With one exception, I found my distinguished callers not only fascinated by the study, but quite willing to have their hand smeared with printer's ink, so that I could make a perfect impression of their lines and mounts. The method was my own, and at the time Cherio was using lampblack, which was far from satisfactory, but he was not too proud to adopt my plan. Even asked for my secret method of removing the ink stains, and I told him. He charged me well for my lesson in palmistry, and I saw no reason why I should give away my great discovery. He then offered me $5 for a small package of the mysterious preparation, and I sold it to him. I didn't know whether to feel guilty or not, and I don't know. The preparation was gold dust. My palm book contained some unusual autographs: John Burroughs, Swami Vivekananda's, Dr. Savage's, many famous Bostonians. But for the most interesting page is the one which contains the contrasting palms of the giant Bostock and the dwarf Chiquita. The one exception who would not allow me to take an impression of her hand was Annie Besant. She was on her first lecture tour of the country, and then, as now, looked upon herself as the bearer of a great message. At the moment I was deeply hurt and disappointed, but I bear no ill for what seemed an unnecessary lack of graciousness, or shall I say professional courtesy. Since those first dabblings, I've studied the occult in many forms and many lands: yogis, swamis, rhythmical dancers, table tippers, spirit photographers, and mediums generally, and I follow with the keenest interest the growing belief that scientists like Sir Oliver Lodge and world figures like Conan Doyle. I have myself had the most extraordinary experiences at seances and spirit demonstrations. I do not reject them. I'm equally interested, eternally interested. As for phrenologists, physiognomists, graphologists, numerologists, and many of the others who work in the daylight, I have no feeling except continued interest of their findings, and so often agree with my own strictly mathematical calculations. Not long ago, I had read a magazine article by Frederick L. Collins, who just returned from an investigating tour had taken him 4 of 5 continents, and he had some extraordinary experience with what he calls ists. His conclusions coincide so closely with my own that I am borrowing his words. I cannot explain such things or such people. Some of them, their information comes no doubt from mind reading, some from experience in sizing up the person for whom they are talking, some from shrewd guessing and building on the guesses which are obviously successful. Some of their effectiveness is due, though it could hardly be true of the skeptic like me, to the eagerness of the sitter, to his responses and his imagination. But the sum of all these explanations does not cover all the knowledge which even the crudest of ists possessed. It doesn't scratch the occult surface of what does one seem to know, and of course it doesn't touch the work of those ists who operate at a distance and on mathematical formulas which have come down through the ages, testing and proving from the days of those Babylonian wise men. I've had my horoscope cast so many times, and by so many different astrologists, that I no longer have the slightest doubt of the mathematical accuracy of the science. Much depends on the efficiency of the astrologer, his interpretation, his figures, his applying them to the individual. That's the difference between a good astrologer and a bad one. But I have absolute confidence that the results obtained by a competent reader of the horoscopes are in no way affected by mind reading, telepathy, or guessing. So when I tell you that the readings I have gathered from the minor ists since I started out give daylight occultism the acid test, correspond in general tenor and detail to the reading of what I consider the greatest of the ists, I am giving final evidence of their baffling and well nigh convincing uniformity. I don't say ists are right. As a practical thinking man, I don't see how they can be. But then, after all, is not the question? What I want to know is, how can they all be wrong? All I ask from anyone who looks into the science of astrology is this same tolerance, but I seldom get it where I feel that I have the most right to expect it. I didn't get it from my family. I do not get it now, except in rare cases, from men and women themselves who are enraged in similar or parallel methods of reaching God and interpreting life. The late Professor Hyslop, who was at the time of his death the head of the American Society for Psychical Research, was just as intolerant in his attitude toward astrology as so many people are in their attitude toward the work which he himself was engaged. He was an impossible combatant, and I remember spending a whole evening explaining the astrological interpretation, the law of vibration, how different planets operate, and how they affect the lives of the individual. For instance, I said, dropping into astrological phraseology, Uranus never fails to bring about a new epoch when it transits the aspects to the radical sun. Wait a minute, he interrupted. What proof can you give me of Uranus or the sun in the heavens? I came to the conclusion that if the learned professor's mental attitude was such that he couldn't see even the light of the sun, he was too blind to receive the guidance of the stars. On another occasion, I had a heated argument with William Jennings Bryan. I found he had two distinct sides of his mind, just as the two sides of his face portrayed two distinct characters. One made it possible for him to be a good promoter of real estate in Florida during the day, and the other a heated champion of fundamentalists in the evening. Just when I supposed I'd convinced him on the fundamental truths of the science, he swung right around and said that God did not intend that we should read the heavens, and so he did not believe in astrology. I again realized it was useless to try to convince a man who had one side of his mind absolutely closed to the facts. Way back in the mauve decade, I had a client who was torn between desire to profit by the teachings of the stars and the conscientious objections similar to those which Mr. Bryan professed. His trouble was that he felt he had no right to anticipate the Lord's good works. One pleasant day he arrived at my studio with a green alpaca umbrella and galoshes. This was too good an opportunity to miss. Why, I asked, are you carrying an umbrella? Oh, he replied quite unsuspectingly, I thought it looked like rain. Shame on you, I said. It was not raining when you left home, so you had no right to anticipate the working of the Lord. Of course, I lost a client, but my position was a sound one. This narrow-eyed weakling, by putting his galoshes, had gone too far, and his limited knowledge permitted. The astrologer, in looking further into the future, profits by his great knowledge of planetary law. The weakling reaches his limit in the possession of a green umbrella. The astrologer knows no limit but the infinite, and the basic trouble with most people who refuse to approach the science of astrology in the spirit of tolerance is what they have depended so long is their pathetic ability to prophesy no further than the afternoon's weather that they cannot grasp the divine truths offered by astrology. I am not disdainful of conventional religion, but I am impatient with some of its camp followers. Especially difficult is it for me to maintain my own tolerance in the presence of people who attribute to God the petty attributes which they themselves possess. No such inverted egoism would be possible if they studied the teaching of astrology. The first thing they would learn is how small they are in comparison to the universe, in which the earth we inhabit is but the smallest of planets, and where the tiniest star in the Milky Way may be the sun of another system. I know it wasn't until I studied astrology that I found my basic relation between myself and the universe. I know it wasn't until I studied astrology that I found any basic relation between myself and the universe, and from that moment I found only contentment but inspiration to go on gleaning more knowledge, which I hope would someday then supplement my experience to grow in wisdom. I'm often asked if I believe in God, and I always answer that I do believe in God, but that I spell him with two O's. Good. The next question is invariably, what do you mean by good? The answer to this question is the essence of my religion. Good is my philosophy. Results from keeping in harmony with the natural laws which make people well, happy, in a big way successful. Evil results from allowing selfish desire to push one, regardless of one's rights and happiness of others. Good brings priceless rewards and gold of happiness. Evil brings inevitable mystery, misfortune, and precise proportion to the unhappiness which caused them. I remember reading a book when I was 10 years old in which a man was dragged by his enemies out of his home into a neighboring wood. He was an evil man, and although nobody knew it, he had murdered his father. Suddenly, to the amazement of his enemies, he cried out in the agony of his soul, Haul me no further. This is as far as I dragged my father. This is the law of action and reaction, and everything is symmetrical. What is given out comes back. No one escapes the divine will. This is astrology's teaching. This is my religion. If it be heathenism, make the most of it. Chapter 5, A Horrible Example. Perhaps the best way to illustrate the process which goes on every day in my studio is to give, so far as I can remember, a sample interview, or rather a few excerpts from a series of interviews with one client. There are thousands from which to choose. The writer of this letter will do as well as any other. Dear Miss Adams, I never did hold with these people who take a bird's eye view of your nose and decide whether you ought to be a plumber or a doctor of philosophy. Suppose you have reconstructed a nose like O. Dempsey's, or a devastated one like most of his opponents. What goes around inside your head has more to do with holding down your job and keeping it quiet than what happens to be growing on the outside of the shell. And as for those psychoanalysts, about the only one I have any confidence in is the man who hands out a pay envelope or a blue slip on a Saturday night. Ask the boss. He knows. In other words, making good is your own business, and you have to tend to it yourself. So when you told me that the stars weren't satisfied with the job I picked out for myself, I dragged out the old horse, laughed, dusted it off carefully, and got ready for the early fall openings. I was then what I'd always been, a businessman. Not a Henry Ford, not even an Etzel, but the head of my own business, and so uncelestial, and to uncelestial eyes, happily married to operating statements and balance sheets for the rest of my working life. But you are through with all that, you insisted. It was a phrase. Now you will travel about the world, deal with governments and dignitaries, become interested in new things, and you will write. Write, I laughed. Well, I can't even tell a story without forgetting the point. You won't need to tell stories, you answered. You'll write about what you've seen and what you've done. That was December 1918, 13 days after the end of the World War. 30 days after the end of the World War. Early in January, I went abroad for the government for 6 months at the Paris Peace Conference. In occupied territory in Belgium. In Central Europe, I dealt with dignitaries. And I became interested in new things. In the fall of 1919, I sold my business. The first part of your prophecy was fulfilled. A few weeks later, I was sitting in the front living room fire in a country house in Kent. What are you going to do? Asked my English host. When will you go back to America? Jump into business again. That's all I know how to do. Don't do it, replied my host. If I had 2 years off at your age, I'd have 27 years ahead of me now. On the ship going home, I went to the bow and looked at the new moon over my right shoulder and decided the Britisher was right that I should take a long rest. But the strain of being a gentleman was too much for me. So one day, without a thought for what you'd told me, I bought a typewriter, and here I am writing what I've seen, writing what I've done, and I'm ashamed to look the first person singular pronoun in its elongated face. The stars in their courses. I do not pretend to understand how they affect destinies of men, but I have to admit, in my own experience, it's been amazing evidence of their infallibility. The writer of this letter said to me, the first time I saw him, I wouldn't know Venus from Aquarius on a moonlit night, and I haven't any more use for the average stargazer than I have for the gypsy at the circus or pink lemonade. But it is true, as he said that I told him. Well, he's still the active executive of a nationally known business. He was, as a matter of fact, president of the Periodical Publishers Association of America, that he would end his days a writer, and here he is, in what he calls the tangled 30s and adolescent 40s, consorting day and night with a portable typewriter. It is also true when I told him that he was still in a dugout New Yorker, that he would travel habitually on matters that had to do with government and dignitaries, and here he is wandering the world, calling on governors, ambassadors, and kings. These things still seem remarkable to this man, but I recall so many more remarkable things which I have told the same client during 10 or 12 years I've known him, and I've asked him to serve as the horrible example. When I first knew this publisher-writer, he had just been sued for $1 million. There were 3 other defendants, but they didn't seem to count. All he could think of was his $1 million in himself, and he knew he was innocent. I guess defendants always do. But the sum was so large and the claim so damaging, he was worried. Now, his wife had been coming to me for years. Every once in a while, she'd tell him if he didn't wear his rubbers, he'd have the gripe, and if he didn't wear his rubbers, and he didn't have the gripe, but he always blamed the spring thaw and not his horoscope. The fact is, he didn't know what a horoscope was, and he couldn't tell it from the Holocaust or a periscope, and he didn't care. And when she told him about the love affairs of some of his best friends were having, he didn't pay much attention. He knew about them anyway. And like the rubbers, he blamed them on the spring. But when she began telling him about the lawsuit, he listened. Don't worry, I said, after consulting his stars. The case will not come up until March or April. Both months are favorable, and if it's April, he can't lose. It was the first week of November, and the trial was set for Tuesday, and on Monday, counsel from the other side asked for postponement. It was granted. Illnesses, absences, previous engagements of the counsel, circumstances of other people's making caused further postponements. The date was put over and entered the courtroom. The judge of his own volition said April 3rd as a trial date, but at this point luck seemed to desert his cause. All the rulings went against him. The plaintiffs introduced their evidence practically intact. The judge refused all motions for dismissal. The case went to jury, but, said his honor, as to the defendant blank, I direct, and then in a statement which exonerated my man absolutely, he directed that his name be removed from the list of defendants and the case against him thrown out of the court. He didn't believe that the astrology decided the lawsuit. He doesn't now. But he left the courtroom with the uneasy sense that the woman he'd never known more knew about his private affairs than he did, so he came to Carnegie Hall, to see who this woman looked like and what this woman looked like. Honestly, how do you expect a businessman like me to believe that planets influence what you and I do, he said. What would convince you, I replied. Evidence. Haven't you been given enough evidence in your own case? No, not enough. All right, I said, reaching for a pile of correspondence. I'll give you mine. I didn't show names. I always take a doctor's attitude toward my patients. But I did show letterheads and read copiously from the contents. One man, president of a New York manufacturing concern, wanted several hundred readings on his employees. A high-ranking Episcopal clergyman writing under the letterhead of the cathedral in the Southwest was interested as to his probable health. The daughter of a Methodist minister in Kentucky, poor white region, used her father's stationery to tell of her troubles with her lover. A young mother in Pasadena wanted help for her disobedient child. One poor soul wrote from Mississippi State Penitentiary, a life prisoner, asking if his horoscope indicated that he would ever get a pardon. My caller shook his head and muttered something about the continuing low mortality of fools. I'm not especially interested in testimonials, he said. What I want are facts. Well, I said, why don't you ask for them? By the way of repartee, he gave me the date of Herbert Hoover's birth, without, of course, mentioning his name. Oh, I snapped, I know this one. He hasn't a chance. No one who's under such bad conditions as he is right now could be elected to do anything, and neither could Leonard Wood. At the moment, it was a winter before Mr. Harding's election. No one, certainly no one in the vicinity of my studio, would have believed that any living man could beat out Hoover and Wood for the Republican nomination, and he said to me as much. Someone will, I replied, but I can't tell who. The big leaders have been to me many times these last months. They always do in presidential years, and I've read the horoscope of every possible candidate I can think of. All I can say is that the nomination will go to someone I don't know, someone whose horoscope I haven't read. At the time, this prediction merely added to his skepticism. However, he tried me again, and this time on a man with whom he had a large business interest. What are his dates? I asked. He didn't know, but who's who did. So I took from a drawer one of the pieces of the white paper on which were printed in a geometrical wheel-like figure and began making my rapid mathematical calculations, the result which I scribbled on the chart. I explained to him the now familiar facts that I was determining that the position of the stars at the time the man was born would influence a great course in his life, and the position of the stars at the present time would indicate special conditions governing the immediate future. Then I began talking about this man as if I had always known him, and the caller had done his own looking at who's who and not disclosed the man's name, giving identifying characteristics and facts which I couldn't give here for fear that you would recognize him. My skeptic told me afterward it was the most impressive part of the whole business, this gift of immediate identification. Our man, I continued, is a very remarkable individual, a gifted one, and I'm glad I haven't had his luck. For the next 2 years, he's coming under very bad conditions, and if I'm not mistaken, he'll either die or go into bankruptcy in July or August, the year after next. Then you advise me to sever relations with him? I don't have to. Your horoscope indicates that you will make complete change in your line of work before long, a year before he has trouble. I should say in August or September next year. He laughed out loud. The next thing applied to his own affairs seemed just too preposterous. Death? That, of course, is always impossible. That was always possible, though, he said. The man in question was as husky as they make 'em. But bankruptcy? With his backing, it was possible, and that he himself should give up business. It was a joke. Some day, I added, without looking up from my charts and books, you'll be writing about astrology. He laughed even more loudly than before. He wasn't a writer. He didn't know anything about astrology. He didn't believe a word I said. Nevertheless, he looked once more in Who's Who and gave me another set of anonymous dates. Lord Northcliffe's. My, I exclaimed, this is an interesting man, a publisher, or ought to be. He's got more money sense than you've ever had, but I believe, here I consulted the charts, that you two were made to work together. That's good, he replied, because I'm sailing Tuesday to visit him. But you mustn't do that, I exclaimed. This is not the time of the year for either of you. Your chart shows you won't accomplish anything by travel right now. You'll have a good time, but you won't make any money, and your Englishman has something on his mind, some serious illness that he's been keeping from other people. He'll be glad to see you. He'll like you. He'll be enthusiastic about whatever you propose to him, but he won't do anything. He can't. In spite of my advice, he sailed on Tuesday. He'd been asked to take the direction in America of a certain international matter that he wished to secure Northcliffe's cooperation in Europe. Well, he saw him, dined with him in London, visited him in Kent, and the famous Britisher was glad to cooperate in the big undertaking. He told his friends and associates that he decided to do so. And on the morning the man was to leave, Broad stairs, Northcliffe took him out on the lawn where he used to sit under a tree to write answers, and fulfilled my prophecy. Our agreements, he said, will have to be conditioned upon my health. I haven't told any one of my associates, but I'm about to undergo an operation on my throat. My physicians say it's nothing, but you understand I can't actually start our plans until I'm up and around again. Northcliffe went immediately under the surgeon's knife. The malady proved far more serious than the great British doctor expected. They sent their patient to Scotland, where he remained a sick man for more than 3 months. Later, when Northcliffe recovered from the operation, my client went abroad to see him. It's no use, I said. Something will happen to prevent the plan from going through. And it did. On the board, the Paris, going over, the ship news carried bulletins of Lord Northcliffe's serious illness. Before he reached London, the great man died. Of course, my skeptical friend, this was just another one of those remarkable coincidences because it's so remarkable, and because it happened in his own affairs, he couldn't forget it. To him, more interesting was it any of my historic predictions: the Windsor fire, the death of King Edward, the death of Caruso, or the war. I wouldn't say it was convincing to him, but at the time it was prejudice shaking. Afterward, I told him, you didn't waste your time. You had to have that experience. That sounds like fatalism. Well, it isn't. I believe with Masterlink that there is no fatality on a spiritual plane. What I should have said was that you did waste your time in the matter of no importance. You were under such a bad planetary condition at the moment, you couldn't afford to waste it. When things are going badly, I'm never worried, for I know that conditions will pass. But when things are going right, I worry for fear I'm not going to take advantage of everything. That's the only kind of worry that's worthwhile. That phrase, under bad planetary conditions, recurred so often in our conversation that he finally asked for an explanation. Did you ever stand under a dome? I asked. Yeah, once in Boston and once in Rome. Boston's good enough. Suppose the State House dome were divided in 12 parts, always in motion, each part a color, and each color ever crossing and recrossing the others. And suppose the planets, instead of politicians, were trying to grow under that dome. It is clear that some plants would have better than yellow some plants would grow better under yellow sunlight than they would under purple or mauve or other things that wither and are too bright a ray. That dome is like the zodiac, and those planets are like you. Now, if you were a gardener, what would you do? I don't know. I'm no more a gardener than I am an astrologer. You'd move the plants about a little to give them the right degree of sunlight. You'd close the leaves of some, you'd open the others, a few of them. If you're a wise gardener, you'd bank all together. That briefly is what astrology's done for you and me. You see, I laughed. It's the Burbank of the sciences. 2 years later, in July, he thought again of this half-forgotten prophecy. He was walking down the short flight of the steps to Della Robbia room of the Vanderbilt Hotel when a friend touched him on the shoulder. Did you hear about X? The man referred to was the one whose dates had given me the gifted man who was to die or go bankrupt in July or August 2 years hence, and July or August was now. He managed a somewhat husky, what about him? The judge just appointed him the receiver. And then he added, gee, you're a lucky dog. He was. In September the previous year, he had suddenly and unexpectedly sold his interest in the now bankrupt institution. Both predictions had come true through the month. I seldom take the responsibility of shifting a man's job, but I found a round person in a square job. I content myself with trying to make him square. But occasionally I find artistic talents hiding under the business bushel, or a vice versa. And when I see by horoscope that the owner of these talents is so strong, and strong enough and big enough to use the advice I can give him instead of being upset by it, I break my rule. Sometimes I'm sorry, but sometimes, just as in the case of my horrible example, I'm profoundly glad. Chapter 6. We are all children of the stars. I've always felt a bit naked in your presence, an old client once told me. You know so many things about me that I didn't know about myself, and then there's that comfort in the thought that Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, Doug Fairbanks, and Secretary Mellon, Miss Asquith, all the other great and near great, are sitting around your studio so exposed to your shameless gaze as if they belonged in a herd of tiny ivory elephants with litter on your desk. That is a terrible indictment of my thoroughly respectable studio. But it isn't an exaggerated statement of the astrology's power to dissect the elements of greatness. Some people think that brains and courage and the industry and imagination and perhaps a little luck are the only factors that enter into the making of a great man. Few, unless they're astrological bugs, give much credit to Uranus and Jupiter, or Leo and Sagittarius, but this is where they are scandalously and unforgivably wrong. The elements of greatness are not so much are not as promiscuous as we think. They don't run around with Tom in preference to Dick or Harry because they like the cut of his Chesterfield or the tilt of his Michael Arlen. They go where the stars send them and they do what the stars say. It was no accident, for instance, that John Burroughs became the greatest naturalist of his day. Mr. Burroughs couldn't have been anything else. He was born in April in the pioneer sign Aries, and under the influence of the earthly sign Virgo, ruling nature's study. The combination obviously and inevitably turned his pioneer spirit toward nature. His moon, the traveling planet, was in the sign of Pisces, ruling the feet. This combination always means great activity and walking. You know what a tramper he was. Uranus was also in the sign of Pisces, indicating that his best thinking could be done while walking. If you've read his book, Camping and Tramping with Roosevelt, you know that this, too, was amazingly true. I could tell you dozens of things like that about Mr. Burroughs. For instance, Jupiter was in his house of friends, indicating that his greatest pleasures, as was indeed true, would come from his friends, rather than his family or close relatives. Venus was in Aries, showing that his pleasure would be intellectual rather than physical. Neptune was in the house of children, foretelling his keenest joy would be in his children, of his imagination, and Uranus was in the house ruling animal life. If John Burroughs had been born a few days earlier or a month earlier, he would have a different set of faculties and possibilities. The sign just before Aries, covering the period between February 21st and March 21st, is Pisces, symbolized by two fishes, one swimming upstream, the other downstream, and the dominating planet is Neptune, which rules invention on a spiritual plane. If a person is born under this sign, it could be said that he should marry a Cancer or Scorpio woman, or someone very sympathetic to those types. If he's in business, he would do well, especially with waterways, steamship companies, and liquids. Pisces people also make good secretaries, teachers, nurses, social and religious workers. Dr. Eliot of Harvard is a good example of the teacher, W.J. Bryan of the religious worker. But most interesting, Pisces people among my personal friends is Mary Garden. Pisces is the water sign ruled by the psychic planet Neptune. But in Miss Garden's case, the sign Taurus, ruling the throat, was in the ascendant, and Taurus is ruled by the entertainment planet Venus. This combination accounts for the fact that Miss Garden's power over her audiences is psychic quite as much as vocal. She has three planets in the house of friends, Saturn attracting the old and serious minded, Venus attracting young people, and the Sun attracting the powers that be. Do you wonder at Mary Garden's popularity and success? Mary Garden is different from other persons born under the same sign because of the peculiar combination of planets and aspects in her particular horoscope. In the same way, each person is different from others born in the same sign. It's obvious, therefore, that the general groupings of many so-called astrological books of a popular sort cannot be relied upon as accurate guides. These books are for the most part based on science, which is often confused with astrology, which is in fact nothing more than solar biology, which concerns itself only with the influence of the sun and does not take into consideration the attributes contributed by the planets. Solar biology is in its own way an interesting study. It's great fun, as many a reader of popular astrological books has found out, but it's not what I call astrology. And no competent astrologer believes that it's possible to say, for instance, that a person born under one sign should marry a person born under another without more information than solar biology conveys. To show the difference between solar biology and real astrology, and at the same time to give the reader a little more fun, which he may expect to get from this book, I shall give the following paragraph some of the general groupings familiar to followers of solar biology, and also one example under each sign of a well-known person whose horoscope has been read with due regard to the influence of all the planets in his particular chart. The former I include as a matter of interest, the latter as a matter of belief. Generally speaking, Pisces is a very good sign for health, but the natural tendency is toward colds, lung trouble, and abdominal disorders. Aquarius people, on the other hand, those born between January 21st and February 21st, tend to have troubles with legs, gout, rheumatism, weak ankles, sprains, and dislocations, and they should choose their life partners from Gemini or Libra types. Aquarius is a great sign for success. 80% of the people in the Hall of Fame were born between January 21st and February 21st. Lincoln, Dickens, Edison, and Ruskin are four names that come to mind immediately. There are hundreds of others. Many of them are not so famous, but just as typical in their smaller spheres. And I'm thinking right now of a little actress, Tallulah Bankhead, the daughter of the late Senator Bankhead of Alabama, and at the present moment, the toast of London. Tallulah, besides being an Aquarius type, has a Neptune in the midheaven of her horoscope, which makes her a born actress and an irresponsible child. Tallulah, I said to her one day in the summer of 1922, you're under particularly good conditions right now for traveling and success abroad. Oh, she exclaimed, I am? Am I? I'll see Charles Cochrane and tell him he must give me something in London. The great London manager, who happened to be in New York at the moment, promised to let her know how things stood when he returned to England. A fortnight later, he cabled her and said he had nothing, just then. Tallulah cabled right back, saying she was determined to act in London. And he replied, do not come at present, but Tallulah was not to be denied. Go to hell, she cabled. I'm coming anyway. Inside of a month, she was a great success of Sir Gerald du Maurier's production, The Dancers. I knew she was clever. I'd heard her imitate Ethel Barrymore at a party where Ethel was present, and do it so perfectly you couldn't tell that it wasn't the real Ethel. The girl in the middle on the floor, the woman listening to her. So I had felt safe in urging her to take her really great abilities where the stars said they would be most appreciated. But even I was surprised at the many-sided successes she immediately achieved. The last time I was in London, I found Tallulah in her dressing room backstage at Wyndham's, receiving a young man who was inviting her to dinner, at which she had a certain other important young personage were to be the guests of honor. At the matinee, I went to tea with this daughter of Neptune, in her London home on Catherine Street, one of the quietest streets near Buckingham Palace, and took the opportunity to give her a little advice. You've won the success Neptune promised you, I told her. Now see if you can control the tendency to irresponsibility with which the same planet threatens you. But you can't beat the stars. I didn't go to that dinner party, but I understand that Tallulah was true to her stars. Climaxed the evening's festivities by turning hand springs on the banquet table in the presence and to the vast edification of the visiting personage. Neptune is a planet so elusive that it cannot be shackled by words. It's apt to break out anywhere in any way. It made Tallulah Bankhead turn handsprings. It makes Eva Le Gallienne play Ibsen. Uranus, Venus, Saturn, and Mercury are all rising in Eva's sign. She was born under Capricorn, which includes all people born between December 21st and January 21st. But Mercury, being in aspect to Neptune, was also in a prophetic sign, Sagittarius, which inclines her to all that is strange and different. Not all Sagittarian people are prophetic. The late Reggie Vanderbilt was born under the sign Sagittarius on December 19th, next to the last day of the Sagittarius period. I didn't know him as well as I do Eva La Galline. Eva's father's helped me to wash dishes here many a time, or rather, Mr. Legine wiped them while I washed. But there are some things I can say about Reggie Vanderbilt that will make anybody thoughtful. His Venus was in Scorpio in opposition to Mars, a condition which makes a man insatiable in his pursuit of beautiful women, and his Mars, being in Taurus, indicated overindulgence in the good things in life. Incidentally, Sagittarius is a sign which rules horses, and Reggie Vanderbilt, when he died, was the president of the National Horse Show Association and the most prominent horseman in Western world. Mr. Vanderbilt fulfilled his horoscope in death quite as much as in life, because he died during the period that was perfectly and peculiarly fatal to people born on or about 19 January, fatal to people born on or about 19th of March, June, September, December. For instance, William Jennings Bryan, born March 19, Charles W. Eliot, born March 20, Robert La Follette, born June 15, and Reggie Vanderbilt, born December 19. Of course, many people whose birthdays fell in these danger periods did not die, but it would be interesting to know how many suffered from nervous upsets about these times when well-known people died. A good many of my friends and clients did, as well as those whose state of health was chronicled in the newspapers. A very dear friend of mine, who was born June 19th, faded dead away one day last winter. When I opened the paper the next morning, I read Mayor Walker of New York City had done the same thing, and to most people, this would have been the merest coincidence, but I am not much of a believer in coincidence. I didn't wait to finish my breakfast. I rushed to the studio to consult my records, and it was just as I had thought. James Walker was born on June 19th, too. All June people who are born under one sign tend toward the same physical weakness. Aries toward the head, Pisces toward the feet and legs, Cancer toward the stomach. Sagittarius toward the hips and thighs, Scorpio toward the groin and bladder, and so on and on throughout the zodiac. And according to astrology, there's just as much variety in the appropriate mates as there is in the appropriate diseases. Aries people should be married to Leo or Sagittarius, Pisces to Cancer or Scorpio, Aquarius to Gemini or Libra, Capricorn to Taurus or Virgo, Sagittarius to Aries or Leo, and Scorpio to Pisces or Cancer. The reasons why these marriages should be ideal become apparent as we study the characteristics of the signs of Scorpio people, for instance, who are apt to be all wrapped up in themselves. They need to complete their lives in a less selfishly inclined sign, like Pisces or Cancer. I don't mean that all Scorpio people are selfish. Great souls like Theodore Roosevelt, Robert Louis Stevenson, and George Eliot are found under this sign, but I can give you a typical example of what I mean. Several years ago, I was dining with Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Martin. That night, Ricardo was to sing Faust at the Metropolitan, so I suggested to Mrs. Martin that she and I go to a play and join him after his performance. If you do, exclaimed the horrified singer, there will be no Faust tonight. Then I learned for the first time that Mr. Martin, a typical Scorpio subject, depended on his wife as minutely as a prima donna does her lady's maid. This man lived so much within himself that during those years abroad when the faction of the opera house in Milan tried to ruin him, forming claques to hiss every appearance on stage, he went right ahead with his singing and did not know anything unusual was happening. One night, when the cat calls were still ringing in the huge auditorium out front, Ricordo was found in his dressing room, stolidly playing solitaire. He succeeded artistically in spite of this untemperamental nature, chiefly, I think, because he had a moon ruling public opinion in his house of the theater. Ina Claire is even a better example of a person who's just succeeded on stage. She is a Libra child, born between 21 September and 21 October, and she has artistic qualities natural to that sign, but more important for her special work, she has 5 powerful planets in the house ruling theater. Neptune is rising in Miss Claire's horoscope, indicating that she would act anyway, on stage or off, and Jupiter, the great fortune, is rising too, explaining why she couldn't help using this histrionic talent for fame and profit. But the most interesting thing in her horoscope is Mercury in aspect to Uranus, the planet of mimicry, a combination which gives to its possessor the power to do things that other people do better than they do them themselves. Your thoughts may go back as mine do to a wonderful night in New Amsterdam Theater several years ago when a little-known musical comedy actress, whose specialty was imitations, walked out on an empty Ziegfeld stage, wearing a famous nun's costume of Belasco's Marie Odile, singing the song, which became more famous than the play itself, and secured for the singer Ina Claire her first engagement as a Belasco star. Back in my Boston days, I had among my intimate friends a man who was much under the influence of Neptune and Uranus as Miss Claire. This man was W.J. Colville, famed in those days as lecturer and mystic, and he was born under Virgo, conventional enough sign, which rules the period, August 21 to September 21, but his Mercury was an aspect to mystical Neptune, the occult Uranus, and practical Saturn. In private life, these conflicting influences made him a rank eccentric. I remember one night at a dinner at Mrs. O'Bull's, Colville suddenly ducked under the table and crawled on his hands and knees for no good reason except that he felt like doing it at the time, which seemed to tap the brains of anybody in the audience of his extraordinary mentality. My Hayward friends were much interested in him and contrived all kinds of tests to trap him, and one night they planted in the audience one of the most expert mathematicians, a man who thought in logarithms as naturally as you and I do in words. Colville was equal to the test. He captured the man's mind so completely that he talked for an hour on mathematical problems in which he himself had absolutely no technical knowledge. Psychic Neptune and occult Uranus give him this power over others and their minds. Practical Saturn gave him the ability to materialize it. Colville had another gift which never failed to astonish his audiences. He would ask for a phrase in a group and then tell a story. As I write, my eye rests on autographed photograph of Cardinal Gibbon surrounded by a group of priests and officers and a company of men who bore their faces on the marks of the daily contact with the grim realities of life. Cardinal Gibbons gave me the photograph on a chipboard. I'll never forget that crossing because a captain gave the cardinal a birthday dinner, at which the latter appeared in all his scarlet robes, and afterward I had a long talk with him about astrology. His Mercury was an aspect to my moon, and this made us very mentally congenial. The cardinal's horoscope startled me at first. It was so much like Houdini's. Both the prelate and the magician had Uranus, Neptune, and Mars, all in aspect to one another. But Houdini also had Saturn in the same relation, suggesting he might be able to use his mystic powers to mystify the world rather than to uplift it. Cardinal Gibbons, on the other hand, was a true son of Leo, and that is, he was born between 21 July and 21 August, and the sun being his ruling planet, couldn't help but lead him to being helpful and having a constructive life. More than this, the three dominating planets were in the humanitarian sign Aquarius, a fact that makes his death, just as we are coming into the humanitarian age, all the more to be mourned. The cardinal's moon was afflicted, showing his happiness would not come through the association with women, and his sun ruling relations with men was not an aspect to anything else in the horoscope. In other words, he was astrologically, as he was in life, a unit unto himself, a complete but rather lonely soul. Of course, Leo isn't the only religious sign. It's impossible to make generalizations about a zodiac. Too much depends on the time of the month and the date the person is born and the positions of the planet at that designated time. Under Libra, for instance, which covers the period between 21 September 21 October, Oscar Wilde, Francis Willard, Lily Langery, Savonarola, Annie Besant, Alfred Dreyfus. Under Virgo, Tolstoy, Queen Elizabeth, Kurt Dumas, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Charles Dana, Gibson, Perishing, Taft, and Asquith. Under Leo, Napoleon, Shelley, Cardinal Gibbons, George Bernard Shaw. There's a quartet for you. Two more famous actresses, Julie Marlowe and Ethel Barrymore, and the great philanthropist Anne Morgan. Between June and Cancer, President Coolidge, Cecil Rhodes, Lord Northcliffe, John Rockefeller, and Rider Haggard. Before these people in Gemini's month in May 21st to June 1st are Jay Gould, Queen Victoria, Richard Mansfield, John McCormick, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Walt Whitman. And in the Taurus month between the 21st of April and 21st of May, Cromwell, Grant, Spencer Turner, Marconi, and Shakespeare. The first group, the Libra people, unless they happen to be Savarnolas or Oscar Wildes, usually prosper as judges, bankers, or engineers. They're strong physically, but they have to guard their kidneys and avoid violent exercises which strain the back. They would do well to choose their life partners among Aquarius and Gemini, or in signs sympathetic to these types. The second group, Virgo children, make good builders, real estate dealers, and because of the dominating planet Mercury, make good writers, secretaries, and teachers, and they should look out for their spleens and should marry people born under Taurus and Capricorn. Leo children, on the other hand, do their best work in executive capacities, and they should marry Sagittarius or Aries. And their tendencies in times of illness are toward disorders of the heart and back. July people, between June 21 and July 21, the group of Cancerites, are strong in any business connected with food and drink. Their life partner should be chosen from Scorpio and Pisces. And as you might expect, they should look out for gastric disturbances and weak digestion. Gemini children born in late May and first 21 of June make good diplomats, lawyers, actors, writers. Their bugbear is neuritis. Their fate in the way of romance is to be found under Libra, Aquarius. In the final group, April 21 to May, Taurus, have before them a wide variety of professions. They make excellent journalists, singers, professional entertainers of all sorts, a genius for children and home life, and are not bad at farming, building, and mining, and they should marry Virgo or Capricorn and take very good care of their throats. All these statements apply only in the most general way to people born under given signs, but more details come when I cast a full horoscope. Take the last group of Taurus people. They all have some of the same traits in common, but are all as different as if they were scattered through the entire zodiac. I would have to know more about the person. Sometimes people seem to have developed a few unusual characteristics of their sign, but in such cases, a peculiar position of their ruling planets explains what the course of their lives have taken. Leonore Ulrich, for instance, is a Cancer child born between 21 June and 21 July. While she has pleasure-loving qualities given by Cancer, she is content to live in and for her work. And why shouldn't she? Uranus is in her house of domesticity, indicating little happiness in a home life. Saturn in her house of relations gives little promise to family joy. Mars and warlike planets in her house of marriage and elusive Neptune in her house of friends, on the other hand, Her planets are most auspicious for professional success. Jupiter is in the midheaven of her home horoscope, protecting her from the threatening conditions, and she has several friendly planets in her house of enemies, showing that even her critics turn out to be friends. And as we all know, Leonore's career on Broadway has been electronically lighted testimony to the infallibility of the stars. Elizabeth Marbury is a person who belied you. Might also say has arisen above her sign. There are not very many public characters born in Gemini between May 21 and June 21, but Miss Marbury's planets are not to be denied. She has the moon, the planet of travel, in the midheaven, making success inevitable through dealings in foreign lands. And as everybody knows, her first triumphs followed her trips to France and her associations with famous continental playwrights. She also has Mercury in a sign which gives her great intuitive qualities in conjunction with Saturn, the cold, scientific, analytic planet, a combination which has given her the balance and shrewdness on which her success as play reader and play agent is undoubtedly founded. The position of her moon is also directly responsible for those close friendships with women, notably Anne Morgan and Elsie de Wolfe, which have been dominating social influences in her life. Often, too, there's one detail in the horoscope of an individual that differentiates him from absolutely all the other members of his group, and I've already spoken of these wonderful Taurus people, including Shakespeare and Herbert Spencer. The natives of this sign, persons between April 21 and May 21, are so gifted that success would seem unescapable, and by now, and then I run across a Taurus person who just cannot seem to fulfill his promise. One was Basil Sidney, the recently successful English actor. I happened to look at his horoscope the other day and recalled the explanation of the actor's long submergence and his sudden rise to public recognition. In Basil Sidney's horoscope, restricting, sometimes sinister planet Saturn was rising at his birth. Where that condition exists, success is almost impossible for the first 28 years of a person's life. This man has lived through that period, and now I told him many years ago he was coming into his own. Again, I say that I'm not a fatalist, and I've had no patience with people who sit down and wait for things to happen, but I do believe the broader philosophy, taught first by the Chinese and later by Tolstoy and his school, recognizing that the wheel of the infinite power is stronger and wiser than our wills, and that we had better work with it instead of against it. I believe that all of us are children of the stars. Stay tuned for the next chapter of A Bull in Heaven, where we'll begin chapter 7 by the deceased Evangeline Adams, astrologer extraordinaire.